there came a moment when staying no longer felt noble. It felt exhausting. Not dramatic exhaustion, the quiet kind, the kind that settles in after long faithfulness with no visible return. She hadn't planned to walk away. There was no rebellion, no anger, no sudden loss of belief, just weariness. She had stayed for a long time. She had trusted quietly. She had remained faithful through silence, repetition, and waiting. And now, something inside her whispered, "What if this is all there is?" That question scared her. Not because it meant she stopped believing, but because it meant believing had started to feel heavy. Faith no longer felt like refuge. It felt like responsibility. She wasn't questioning God's existence. She was questioning endurance. How long can I keep doing this? Is staying still faith or just habit? Am I being faithful or just afraid to leave? These were not loud doubts, they were honest ones. She noticed how close she was to disengaging quietly, not leaving church, not renouncing faith, just pulling back emotionally, praying less honestly, trusting less openly, expecting less, so it wouldn't hurt as much. Walking away didn't mean abandoning God. It meant protecting herself. And that was the danger, because sometimes walking away doesn't look like departure, it looks like distance. She realized then that this was a turning point, not between belief and unbelief, but between shallow staying and real trust. She stood at the edge of a decision no one else could see. Stay, even if faith felt risky again, or step back, slowly, safely, quietly. And for a moment, walking away felt easier. Easier than hoping again. Easier than trusting deeply. Easier than remaining open. In a season that had already taken so much. If you've ever reached that place where faith doesn't collapse, but weakens under its own weight, stay with this. This message is for the woman who almost walked away, not because she stopped believing, but because believing started to cost her more than she expected. And if these words feel uncomfortably close, consider subscribing. Not for the channel, but so your heart always has a place to return when faith feels heavy and staying feels risky. Now, let's talk about what brought her to that edge. She didn't reach the edge because of one bad moment. It was the accumulation, the weight of staying faithful. When nothing seemed to respond, the cost of trusting without being reassured, the exhaustion of hoping quietly for a long time. Nothing dramatic had happened. That was the problem. There was no crisis to explain her fatigue, no collapse she could point to, no visible reason to justify how tired she felt. Life simply continued, and she continued with it. Day after day, faith asked the same things of her. Pray, trust, remain open, don't harden your heart. And over time, those requests began to feel heavy, not because they were wrong, but because they were constant. She realized how little space there was to rest emotionally while staying faithful. Faith required presence, attention, honesty, and honesty is costly. When answers are slow, she noticed how often she carried disappointment silently. Not dramatic disappointment, the quiet kind, the kind that doesn't cry out, the kind that just sits there, unresolved. She had learned to manage it, to function with it, to keep going without naming it. But unspoken weight accumulates, and eventually, it reaches a point where the heart asks for relief. She wasn't angry at God. She was tired of not knowing if staying was still doing anything. She began to wonder whether faithfulness was turning into endurance without intimacy, whether obedience was becoming a habit instead of a relationship. That question unsettled her, because she didn't want a faith that was merely functional. She wanted a faith that was alive. But aliveness requires vulnerability, and vulnerability had already cost her a lot. She realized that staying faithful had demanded more courage than leaving ever would. Leaving would have simplified things. It would have lowered expectation, reduced risk, protected her from future disappointment. Staying meant remaining open to hope, and hope had already hurt her before. So slowly, without anyone noticing, she drifted toward the edge. Not because she wanted to abandon God, but because she wondered how much more her heart could carry. And that is where the real tension began. The temptation wasn't to walk away loudly. It was to slip away quietly, to stop expecting so much, to stop praying so honestly, to stop hoping so openly, not to abandon faith, but to soften it, to make it less demanding, less vulnerable, less costly. She didn't imagine herself leaving God. She imagined herself protecting her heart. She thought about what it would feel like to lower the stakes, to keep believing, but without risking disappointment, to keep obeying, but without staying emotionally engaged. Faith without exposure, trust without expectation. That felt safer. She noticed how easy it would be to let devotion become routine, to pray polite prayers instead of honest ones, to obey mechanically instead of relationally. No one would notice. From the outside, everything would look the same. She would still show up, still do the right things, still say the right words, but inside, she would be retreating. And that was the danger, because walking away quietly often begins with self-protection, disguised as wisdom. It's healthier this way. I'm just being realistic. I can't keep hoping like this. Those thoughts didn't sound rebellious. They sounded reasonable. She realized that this was not a question of belief versus unbelief. It was a question of trust versus control. Leaving quietly meant regaining control. Control over how much she expected, control over how much she felt, control over how much she risked. Staying required something else. It required surrender. Surrender of the need to protect herself from disappointment. Surrender of the illusion that she could manage faith safely. She felt torn. Part of her longed for relief. Another part knew that pulling back would cost her something irreplaceable. Because faith that is no longer vulnerable slowly stops being faith. It becomes management. And God was not calling her to manage belief. He was calling her to trust Him with her heart again. That was the hardest part. Not staying faithful, but staying open. She stood at that quiet crossroads. No one else could see. And for a moment, the path of quiet withdrawal felt merciful. But she sensed deeply and clearly that something sacred was at stake. What scared her most was not leaving. It was staying open. Leaving would have closed the door on expectation, on disappointment, on vulnerability. Staying open meant risk. Risking hope again. Risking trust again. Risking being let down again. She realized that faith was not asking her to endure more pain. It was asking her to risk intimacy again. And intimacy always carries risk, because to remain open with God is to admit that He still matters deeply, that His silence still affects her, that His timing still shapes her, that His presence still has weight. Pulling back would have numbed that. Staying meant feeling. She noticed how much courage it took to remain emotionally available when faith had already cost her so much. It would have been easier to harden slightly, to create distance, to believe, but from behind a wall. But God was not asking her to prove loyalty. He was inviting trust. Trust that remaining open would not destroy her. Trust that God was not careless with her heart. Trust that disappointment was not the final word. She realized something essential. Faith that survives is not the faith that feels safe. It is the faith that dares to remain honest. She didn't stay because she felt certain. She stayed because she believed God was still worthy of her openness. And that belief was fragile, but it was real. Staying open meant she could be hurt again, but it also meant she could be healed more deeply. And she sensed quietly that God was not finished working in her. Closing her heart would have ended the struggle, but it would have ended the relationship too. So she chose the harder path, not because it was noble, but because it was true. In the end, she didn't stay because things improved. She stayed because something inside her settled. She realized that leaving would have given her relief, but not peace. Relief comes from escape. Peace comes from trust. She saw that God had not been absent during her fatigue. He had been present in ways that did not announce themselves. He had carried her when she couldn't feel it, steadied her when she didn't notice, held space when faith felt heavy. She realized that her exhaustion did not disqualify her faith. It revealed her humanity. God was not disappointed in her for reaching the edge. He met her there. Staying did not mean pretending everything was fine. It meant choosing relationship over self-protection, choosing trust over control, choosing openness over numbness. She didn't suddenly feel strong. She felt honest, and honesty was enough. She remained, not because she had answers, but because she trusted that God could hold her questions. She didn't walk away. And that choice, quiet, unseen, deeply personal, became the turning point. Not because everything changed, but because she did. She almost walked away, not because she stopped believing, but because believing had begun to cost her. She stood at the edge between self-protection and trust, and she stayed. Not heroically, not confidently, but honestly. She learned that faith is not proven by how strongly we hold on, but by whether we remain open when holding on feels risky. If you're standing at that same edge, tired of hoping, tempted to pull back quietly, wondering if staying is still worth it, let this be your reminder. God is not asking you to endure alone. He is asking you to trust Him with your heart again. And that trust, even fragile, even tired, is still faith. If you want a place to return when faith feels heavy and staying feels risky, consider subscribing. Not for the channel, but for your journey, because the God who met her at the edge will meet you there too.